or the impact of the crisis on the subject, on the theme that you are going to discuss. I'm very pleased to have such a diverse panel of members of the panel. I hope that approaches also bring to us a diversity that we are needing to approach the subjects. And I prefer immediately to start with our first speaker, which is Branko Milanovic, economist from the World Bank Department, senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. And the subject is Global Income Inequality, the effect of new PPP data and some speculation regarding the impact of the financial crisis. So you are most welcome to, please. Each panel member will have 20 minutes presentation, then more 20 minutes to respond to questions. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here at the World Social Forum and to be also in Bergen. So thank you very much for the organizers. As our chair said, we will divide the presentations so that in a spirit of equality, obviously everybody will have about 40 minutes. And I will speak for about 20 minutes and leave 20 minutes for the questions and answers, because I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and I will not be able to go through all the slides nor to live up to the full expectation of what is in the title, because I will not really have much time to say much about the implications, possible implications of the crisis, simply because there are lots of other things to say first. So now let me start with something which is really a methodological introduction. It may be a little bit boring, but if you go through this one slide, I think actually it would illuminate some of the other things that I have said, that I have to say afterwards. When you think of the world, you can think of the world, and I actually, of course, urge you to start thinking now, at least for these 2 hours, of sort of global world as a single entity. You can think of that in 3 different ways, because we are divided still, of course, in nation states. You can think of that as international inequality, which is inequality between mean incomes of the countries. This is the first row that you see there, where there are 3 individuals. They all look different, so I don't need to describe. One looks like a spy, another looks like a circus performer, and the third one like a soccer player. But their height represent their average incomes of their countries. So there is a poor country, middle income country, and rich country. One way to calculate inequality is just to take all the countries, like in UN General Assembly, calculate an inequality coefficient across them, and then say, okay, is the world getting more equal or less equal? This is also known in economics as the issue of income convergence or divergence. Convergence obviously means that the poor and rich countries are closer together, so the poor countries are catching up. Divergence means that the poor countries are not catching up. So we will see what happened in history and in the last 50 years with that. So that's concept 1. Concept 2, very briefly, is the same. Each individual enters with the average income of his or her country, but as you can see, they are population weighted. So now big countries like China would matter much more than small countries like Luxembourg. So there will be another concept, so maybe we will see the world converging there or diverging there. The third concept is incomes of individuals. So here you can see each individual enters with her or his income. These incomes would be expressed in PPP dollars so that we take into account lower price level in poor countries. But as you can see, there are people who are in a middle income country, and they can be either rich or middle income globally or poor globally. So we all enter with our actual incomes. And nationalities, or actually citizenship, there really don't matter. We are basically all lined up according to their income. So these 3 concepts, so how have they moved over the last 55 years? And I called it the mother of all inequality disputes, because we often use the same words to mean different things. And if we want to go forward, at least figuring out what has happened, we have to use same words when we mean the same thing. So the first concept of or what is called what I call international inequality, because unweighted international inequality, because it is between nations, not between individuals, is this one. So what you see here, and I'll show you even better on a different graph, you see that actually in the last, this is the Gini coefficient on the vertical axis. So as it goes up, inequality goes up. Okay, from about 1980 over here, you see that gradual increase, but steady increase in inequality. So that means that mean incomes of the countries are diverging. In other words, the world is not converging, but diverging, expressed in terms of mean incomes of the countries. There is a little bit of a change after 2000. I'll talk about that in a second. But basic picture there is a divergence of income. So that has been established by other people. This is not the first time, but it's nice to put it in a context. Now, when you do population weighting, you find the exact opposite picture. The world, according to this concept 2, international equality, is converging. Now, it's not a big sort of a issue like why is it happening. It's obviously happening because big countries like China and India have had high growth rate. And what you notice here, from about 1980, after the Chinese reform and the beginning of strong growth performance of China, China, of course, is a great force for global equalization by its growth. Now, you should not, I mean, China is there are two issues there to be mentioned because everybody gets excited about China. Two issues are the following. First, don't forget that China is still a very poor country and far from the rich world. The ratio of incomes between China and the United States is 10-1. So just be sort of cool about that. Second, however, if China continues to grow like that for another 20, 30 years, well, China is no longer going to be the force for global equalization, because if the other countries do not catch up, at some point China might become a force for global disequalization. So one has to keep all these relativities in mind. But currently, it is a force for huge global, obviously, equalization. And historically, I like to say that there has never been a time in history where so many people have seen their incomes increase so much within a prolonged period of time of 30 years. So it's a world history changing event. But if you take China out, as you can see, there is concept 2 inequality is not really changing very much. Ergo, the result is really driven mostly by China, and we'll see in a moment also by India, but principally so far by China. Now, what are these dots? This is the global inequality, or the concept 3 between individuals. Why do I have only dots there? The reason why I have dots only there is because it's based on household surveys, because the only way to find out inequality within nations is if you have household surveys. And I will not bore you with that, but the household surveys are not available for each country every year, so you have basically to bunch them into particular years. And here I have 88, 93, 98, 2002, and maybe at the second forum I might have 2005. But what you can see is that obviously that inequality has to be higher than the inequality before, because it includes within national inequalities. Not all Chinese have the mean income of China. Not all Americans have the mean income of the United States. So this is a very high inequality. And it gets even higher with the use of this new PPP, so which I will say something in a minute. But this is an inequality of a Gini coefficient of 70. Now, what does 70 mean? Gini coefficient ranges from theoretical value of 0, where everybody has the same income, to 100, where one person has the entire income of the country. The good way to think about that is to say that West European countries, or countries like Finland, for example, also West European, but Nordic countries that are relatively equal, have a Gini of about 30. That's like a minimum. US, another way to think, US, China, Russia have a Gini of 40. Latin American countries are over 50. And most unequal countries like Brazil and South Africa around 60. Colombia is also around 60. So the world is, of course, more unequal than even most unequal country like South Africa. So if you think of the world, you actually have to think of a place which is more unequal than South Africa. So it's not a coefficient that you can find normally anywhere, only when you have this large aggregation. So this is the same thing with, I'm not going to comment on that, same thing with the new PPPs, except to point out the fact, which is not totally well known, but it's an important fact that all these calculations are based on what is called PPP, which means that you convert local incomes in this currency called international dollar, which in principle should give you the same purchasing power in India, China, United States, Zambia, Congo, wherever. Now, the thing there is that according to the latest exercise, which was done 12 years after the previous one, it has been found out that China, which for the first time participated in this, and India, which for the first time participated since 1985, it turns out that price levels in those countries are higher than we thought. What is the implication of that? The implication of that is that both India and China are significantly poorer in PPP terms than we thought. What is the implication for global inequality? Is that global inequality is much higher than we thought because basically lots of people are now made poorer. As you might have seen, actually the World Bank has revised poverty numbers, and the level of poverty is now much higher than it was thought before. This is dramatic change. They are not talking about small changes. We are talking about the revision of national accounts of China and India and Indonesia and the Philippines to the extent of 40%. So in one day, China has become 40% poorer according to these numbers. And I think actually this non-trivial change has basically affected many results in economics, but has not yet trickled down sufficiently. But here, obviously, for global inequality, it has great, obvious implications. Let me just go see our chair. What is our chair going to say in terms of how I'm doing now? I'm doing still okay. Okay, that's good. So what I want to hear to say is that these are the same graphs, simply redisplayed with new PPPs in slightly different format. And the reason why I called it also the mother of all inequality disputes is because people who actually want to emphasize inequality in this world actually tend to focus on concept one, where the countries are diverging. And they're diverging because the rich world in the last 30 years has actually grown very well. Africa has declined. Latin America and Eastern Europe, which were like middle-class continent, have basically also gone down. So that's why there was this large divergence between the countries. But if you want to actually put a positive spin, then you take concept two and say, look, what is really excellent is that China and India, that used to be very poor countries, are now moving more towards the middle. So in that sense, this is the mother of all inequality disputes, because depending on which aspect you want to emphasize, you might have a very positive story to tell, or you might have a rather negative one to tell. But the last 5 years, this is circled here, is something that we have seen a really positive development. We see that actually concept one starts now converging. The Gini is going down. Why was it the case? Because many countries in Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Africa had a period of relatively high growth rates. So these high growth rates are now reflected there. Secondly, we see concept two now declining even faster because India is now taking the role, adding to the role of China. So we have two engines of this kind of convergence, India and China. And of course, the big question is what will happen with the crisis? Will these hopeful developments continue? We should not get overly excited about them because, as you can see, concept one, inequality is still very high, even with this small change which happened in the last 5 years. All of the things I'm going to skip because these are methodological issues, but I want to point out one historical trend which one should also keep in mind. The world as it is now is a world where the dominant source of inequality between individuals is citizenship, because the most of inequality comes from inequality in mean incomes of the countries. If this is the dominant force for inequality, that also means that each person who is born in a rich country receives what you can call a citizenship premium, because large part of his or her income depends on citizenship. That has at least two implications and has many more also. One implication is that politically speaking, that's why I call it a non-Marxist world, means that there cannot be under Marxist world, as I will show you here, how the world looked in approximately, this is inequality in 1870 and inequality in 2000, global inequality. In 1870, the largest source of inequality was within nations. In other words, you had rich and poor people within nations. Differences between countries were small. Give you another example. The difference between India and China, which were among the poorest countries then, and the Netherlands, which was the richest country then, was 3-1. The same difference between the top and the bottom today is 100-1. The difference between China, despite the spectacular growth, and UK is 7-1. So, even between, countries that have done well recently and the rich world, these differences have increased. So one implication is that if you believe that there is some kind of a proletarian solidarity between classes, well, it could theoretically make sense in the world in 1870 because the largest source of income differences is your class. Well, that cannot make sense in the world of 2000 because the largest difference between your incomes is difference due to nation and to citizenship. So it's very hard to see how workers from poor countries, how workers from rich countries who are actually rich in the global scale are going to unify with low classes in poor countries which are really on the bottom. So this is in that sense, a big change in a source of inequality, and I think implicitly a change in the politics, global politics. Last point, there are several implications. Another implication is migration. If there are such huge differences between countries, either you basically have three things to think in your boxes. One is globalization, another is large country differences, the third one is immobility of labor. These three things cannot just keep on going forever, because if there are large country income differences, labor is going to move. Whether you want it or not, they are going to move because they can increase their wages by 5, 6, 7 times. I'll show you, if I have time, one graph with these points in the world where actually greatest differences exist. Greatest differences exist. The second possibility, if you want to stop that, or actually believe that there should be some sort of more managed transition or migration, there are two possibilities. One possibility to build a big wall and, wall of people, which actually is happening, as we know, in the US, which is happening with Europe becoming a fortress with these speedboats stopping people. Another possibility, poor countries have to grow faster. Because if poor countries grow faster, or one of these 3 points, globalization here, large country income differences, if they start diminishing, then likewise the pressure on migration will diminish. So either we will have one or the other, 2 minutes, one or the other force to give in, because the three of them, the 3 balls, cannot really exist permanently like that. So on migration, I want to illustrate, these are many other things that I'm going to skip, but here are the main points. It is not based on any study on migration per se. It's simply based on the study of inter-country income differences, where they are the largest and where the physical proximity is small. This is a very simple-minded approach. And you will notice, actually, there are 7 such points. I'm not going to go through all of them. You know geography. 3 of them really don't matter for political reasons. Israel and its neighbors, we are not going to see there, for political reasons, much of pressure, although, of course, we know that many Palestinians work, several million actually work in Israel. South and North Korea, obviously, huge difference in income, but there is DMZ there. And then Saudi Arabia and Yemen, also not much movement. But all the other 4 points are really points where you do have lots of movement. These are the points where basically the barriers are being built. One interesting thing is to notice that in all these 4 points, you have the largest migrating nation moving to the other nation with which it shares neither the language nor the religion. So it's really, essentially, I would argue, income-based because of huge income differences. In all these 4 points, the gap between the recipient nation, which receives migrants, and the key nations that send migrants has grown in the last 20 years. And that would be my last slide, just to show you the ratio of, the level of gaps. As you can see, between Spain and Morocco has gone from 6.5 to 7.5. It has gone between Greece or Macedonia and Albania. There are no data on Albania for the 60s, but that has grown from 2 to 4, so it has really doubled. and of course, as you can see, US and Mexico from 2.6 to 3.6. So in all these cases, the richer nations have grown faster, the poor nations have not grown or have grown more slowly, and the gap has increased, and the migration has happened. So on this note, I will stop.
Thank you. Shall we open to the floor? Questions, please? Yes, could you please introduce yourself and...
I'm Vladimir Popov from the New Economic School in Moscow. The question is about the long-term perspective. And I know that Grant did some work on the historical income inequalities during recent 500 years or 1,000 years. It is my understanding that in 1500, in between countries, income inequalities were virtually non-existent, because all the countries had the same level of GDP together. Now, the story between 1500 and 1900 is the increase in income inequalities up to the point of probably something like 60%. Yes, Gini increased to 60%. The 20th century is hovering around 60%. And the question is whether this perception is correct. And what is the trend for the future? Does it mean that if the increase in income inequality slowed down during the 20th century, and especially during the second half of the 20th century, right? Does it mean that we're at the turning point?
Well, this is an excellent question. You know, it's actually, as Vladimir described it, basically if you think of inequality in the long run, with, of course, all the caveats that really a lot of that is guesswork, because we didn't have household surveys in those days, although we had something, you know, social tables. Basically, the story is that you have an increase. Let's start from either 1500 or actually 1800, or with the Industrial Revolution, 1750. You have a steady increase in global inequality. This Gini, as Vladimir said, goes up, goes up. And in the 20th century, it sort of plateaus around a very high level of 65, Gini 65, or actually Gini 70 now with the new PPP numbers. But it's really a shift increase because it has to be carried backwards too. So basically it has plateaued. And it could be now that it's actually on the verge of sort of starting declining. Why would it be decline? I already explained, because of China and India. Now, what is in that case, in an optimistic scenario, this global inequality might actually decline, driven by what happens in China and India. And really, in other words, the key players are there: US, China, and India, because of their population sizes and sizes of their economies. So if these three key players become closer in terms of incomes, and again, I remind you that the differences are very big, then, of course, we might have charted historically an inverted U-shaped, and in 50 years, we may be really going down in a significant way. So this is, of course, a very optimistic scenario. There are, of course, many others that you can imagine that would not be as optimistic. But one more thing just to keep in mind is that that scenario is compatible with rising inter-country inequality, unweighted. And that rising inter-country inequality per se is not a very good thing for many reasons, including migration and so on. So we might be in a situation which is very good that at least we have now reached the peak in terms of individual inequality are going down, but the inter-country inequalities keep on increasing. So that would be a source of strain.
Okay, please. Yes, please. You can use the microphone. Yes,
and I will answer more quickly now,
yes,
shortly,
please.
because we are running out of time.
Yes.
No, it's very fascinating presentation, but I guess if you look at it from the point of view of transition, of a world in transition, the argument in favor of the inverted U-type advances. Because if you take it, about half of the world is still peasants as of 2008. And they are moving to urban, modern way of life, and very fast. For example, in migration. Migration, you have some migration tiny migration going from south to north, about 4 million people a year.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, you have 50 million people a year going from countryside to cities. So really, that's the point you have to study to look at the trend. And well, take Chile, for example.
Well,
we
please,
have
please
data.
be brief. So we have 5.
Yeah, very, very short. We have data for a century. And income inequality has decreased impressively. Decreased. But income inequality has changed brutally because it depends on things like political power. It increased, it improved until 1973, and then after the coup, it went down brutally. I mean, it changes a lot, but on the long run, it improves.
Okay, thank you.
I agree with that.
Well,
I have nothing really. Yeah.
You, please, and you and third, and I want
Should
to
I combine the questions or
Yes,
answer
I
one by
think
one?
that I was about to propose that.
Okay, okay.
We hear 1, 2, 3, and then you reply to all of them. I don't want to take any more.
Prakash Kashwan from the Indiana University, Bloomington. I missed part of your presentation, but we see a very interesting trend where even intra-country inequalities are on increase in many of the same countries that you suggest are contributing to decline in global inequality. And we see this in, for instance, in the way in which the implications of inequality are for the international negotiations such as WTO are blunted by intra-community, intra-country inequalities. So what are the implications?
Yes, please.
I'll very quickly draw you, I'm Ravi Srivastava from Jawaharlal University, Delhi. I'll very quickly draw you into the second part of your paper title, which you've not been able to deal with, that is the impact of the crisis. Now what you dealt with is really China and India, and both of them had a structural break around late 1970s in terms of growth. But if you look at very recent trends, you have a large group of economies, diverse economies, 30, 35 countries, showing a very rapid rate of growth, and hence the last part of your graph. Now this rate of growth in the last few years cannot be divorced from the impact of the financial flows and so on. In other words, the crisis will now impact differentially on different groups of countries. It will also impact differentially on intergroup inequality, inter-country inequalities, intra-country inequalities, particularly in India and China, where these were growing very rapidly. So overall, it's very likely that the type 1 inequalities may grow, but type 2 inequalities, we need to think a little more seriously about. And that's one question. I'm being very quick, but I think the second is on migration. I think, there is a tendency to simplify and in some sense, to focus a bit too much on interweight differentials between countries as a driving force of migration, because you forget the role that skilled migration is currently playing in the development of the rates of growth of the North. Right, and it's a very large flow of migration, generally not captured by labor migration statistics, which focus on this thing. And if you look at skilled migration, for instance, from India, or from South Asia into countries of the North, Japan.
But it should be captured. Okay.
Yes,
It doesn't get picked up.
sorry.
Follows on from the same one, Peter Martin from Andres. Does the current context introduce any fundamental changes in the trend you described, or is it a blip on the screen?
Yes, I think that
Let me go very quickly on the first one, a question of general, trend. Yes, I agree. Actually, of course, the world is becoming now from rural moving to urban. As we know, a few years ago, it was like 50% mark. But I'm really leery of forecasts that assume that actually China is going to repeat the same 30 years. We don't know that. We didn't know in 79 that China will grow like as it did. I don't think we can actually see. I think we can say, okay, if this happens, this will probably happen globally. But to put too much emphasis on this, I'm skeptical on that. You see now there are too many questions combined. I forget the second one, which was within. That's what actually I put this here. The within, I didn't have actually time to speak, but of course over this quarter century, practically no large countries, and India, China, United States are examples, within inequality has gone up. And that's why global inequality, to intuitively feel what happened, is difficult. As you can read this slide, you have two forces for actually global inequality increased. that's within national, which gets worse, and divergence between countries. And then you have one big force for equalization, which is China and India growth rate. But within each of these two countries, and actually I work with China and India as urban China and India and rural China and India, the gap between rural and urban has increased, and the gap between the states has increased. On the effects of the financial crisis, I think, but of course this is a guesswork because nobody knows what will happen. But I guess that if the first wave, certainly of the financial crisis, has affected richer countries more. So in that sense, there would be the continuation of that convergence in trend 2. So that would continue. But what I'm afraid is that the second wave might actually affect poor countries more. And there are two precedents, I'll be very quick on that. One is the Great Depression. If you look at the Great Depression, the first wave affected rich countries more, the second wave, poor agricultural countries more. The second precedent in the crisis of the 70s, which basically, 79 to 82, which basically led to really total slowdown in growth in Latin America, then also in Eastern Europe and so on. So we don't know in 3 years when the IMF loans get due to be repaid with deteriorating terms of trade for many of the countries, whether that would continue. So that was. I'm sorry. East Europe and Latin America and also Africa. So we might have a sort of, in a really pessimistic scenario, repeat of that really gap in growth over 20 years, where we had actually during 5 or 6 years, we had a good time because that gap in growth between countries has diminished. As you know, Africa had like 4 or 5% growth rate for 6 years.
Any more questions? There is 5 minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry, there was one
yes.
more.
Yes.
I did not reply to the.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay. Now there is one more question he must reply.
I'm sorry, but could you repeat the question? Just
about the implications.
about the implications of the crisis. So,
And sorry. Shall we take that one
Okay.
and you reply to both of them?
I realize that in a sense your first sort of measures of world income inequality does not really are not directly affected a bit, they might be indirectly affected. But could you say anything on that for global inequality?
Well,
household savings?
no, yeah.
Okay, you can stop.
No, if you want to. No, because on this one it's a very short answer. The answer is no. So, it's not taken into account. I don't have the data. It's actually very difficult because you would actually have to have fertility rates by income groups. So, these two things are very hard to combine. I mean, joint distribution is hard to combine. I'm working now on joint distribution between education and income, and it's very hard. I totally sort of agree with you, but unfortunately there is nothing I can do about that so far.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Jean. I'll ask now Rohini Somanathan. I'm pronouncing it right. She's from the Department of Economics, Delhi School of Economics, and has a PhD in economics, Boston University. Her paper is Affirmative Action and Social Mobility in India.
Thank you very much for having me here, and to Branko for setting me up, talking about India and about within country inequality. So I decided to talk about affirmative action and social mobility. I thought it the ideal forum to talk about policies that try to attack inequality by using social identities, which is what affirmative action in India has done. So what I'll do today is reflect on the effects of these policies. So India has the largest affirmative action program in the world, both because India is large, but also because the program is really large. So about half the seats in elite public universities and public employment are reserved for what are termed disadvantaged groups. And what I'd like to talk about today is what notions of disadvantage have been and how disadvantage itself has evolved. So these affirmative action programs actually came in a long time ago. They came in under colonial rule in the 1920s, but they've evolved in many ways. How have they evolved? Well, the groups, they were always based on social identities, in particular caste, although religion very early. And the identities of the eligible groups have changed. So who is eligible is different now from what it was. The share of seats that have been reserved has changed. So very recently, it's gone from about a quarter to about a half. And the classification of disadvantage has changed. So I'll have to explain these things in more detail later. But I'm going to talk about these changes. And ultimately, the effectiveness of any affirmative action policies depends on how well you classify the disadvantaged, how many times there are people who are poor that are left out, and vice versa, and how these programs effectively work as instruments of social mobility. So I'm going to talk about those things. So the outline of today's talk is the following. I'll start with a case for affirmative action and start by arguing that even if you were only interested in efficiency, there may be a case for affirmative action, and I'll just broadly outline that. And then I'll talk about caste and its classification in India, because caste has been the primary classification for affirmative action programs. I'll talk a little bit about the historical context and how affirmative action has evolved, and then present a little bit of data. This already seems too ambitious. I'll present a few numbers on caste and changes in educational attainment over the last 70 years. I say 91, I'll talk a little bit about later. And then I'll reflect a little bit on the alternatives. So whenever you look at problems of inequality, you can have targeted programs that say, we identify the disadvantaged and then we transfer resources to them. Or you can have universal programs that say, everyone should go to school, everyone should get healthcare. And I'll reflect a little bit on what might be the way ahead with each of these programs in India. So that's the plan. So the case for affirmative action. So here's just a simple picture. You have two groups. And the premise of all affirmative action is that there is a group that has been historically disadvantaged. So imagine that you have two groups with the same distribution of ability, but for various reasons, historical, political, one group has had less access to various types of public spending. So what should you do in this case? Well, even private institutions, so a lot of affirmative action, it's not called that, but a lot of universities and schools all over the world practice affirmative action, and in the sense that they have different thresholds for the entry of different groups. And that's perfectly reasonable, even if all that you want to maximize, think of Harvard University that wants to maximize the illustriousness of its alumni. And what it'll go out there and say, well, there's certain people who are very able, but they're not going to do as well on standard scores because of disadvantage. So if we can have a lower score, we're going to get in this group of people, and they're going to be very good for us in the long run. So even if we don't care about equality at all, we might have a case for affirmative action on efficiency grounds. Of course, when you're thinking about social justice, then you have to think about what justice means, which is a very complicated discussion. And controversial discussion. But one notion of meritocracy might be that we want people who we think are equally able to have the same opportunity. And in that sense, what you would do is you would have thresholds that would capture equal shares in each of these scales. So in each of these cases, you would have different thresholds for group 1 and group 2, and how different these thresholds are would really depend on what you wanted to achieve. But this is just to say that they're very reasonable arguments in favor of affirmative action. And so what we really want to do is look at the extent to which these objectives have been brought out by actual affirmative action policies in India. So caste has probably attracted more attention from the social sciences than any other feature of the Indian economy. And what are some of the features of this caste structure that are important when we think about affirmative action? Well, one is its complexity. So there are, no one quite knows how many, because every time a group invents a name and says we call ourselves this, it's a new caste in some sense. So the caste structure is extremely complex. Anthropologists have documented, there's a very fat set of volumes put together by the Anthropological Survey of India. This documents over 6,000 castes. If we look at historical census documents, we have lists of at least 1,000 castes. So there are many, many, many of these groups that distinguish themselves by a caste name. So one is its complexity. The other is that castes are segregated in the sense that there's endogamy, and there are various rules that govern social interactions and pollution. The third is that the caste structure has been associated with a particular type of mobility whereby individuals within castes move up and down together. So traditionally, the way that mobility occurred was to say that we give ourselves a new name, we adopt a new set of practices, and we claim parity with a different set of groups than we did before. So mobility occurs in a different way. But one of the very important features of caste is that it's not an index. It's not something that you can look at and identify people by. You can't look at people and say what caste they belong to. It's essentially self-reported. And this caused considerable anguish for census commissioners who said, well, this caste was 500,000 at the last census, and now it's 200,000, and then there's this new caste that's appeared. Because essentially, caste is self-reported. And so whenever you're thinking about programs, you have to deal with something like that. So as a result, what affirmative action programs in India did were to classify groups into categories, because you can't have 6,000 categories that you're dealing with. So lists were made originally by the colonial government in the 1920s, formalized in the 30s, and different lists were made in the 1950s after independence. But what was done was to really put people in 4 broad categories. The disadvantaged or the untouchable castes, which were disadvantaged because of norms of pollution in interaction with other castes. The disadvantaged tribes, a group that was called the other backward castes, and then castes that were not eligible for affirmative action at all. Okay, so there were these 4 groups. Where am I time-wise?
You have 16 minutes.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, so the British realized that disadvantage is complex, and the names that it attached to groups that it called disadvantaged kept changing. So they had a group that they called the untouchables sometimes, and they called the same group the depressed classes sometimes. They called another group backward classes. Then they had various other terms, backward tribes, criminal tribes, forest tribes. So there was a great richness of nomenclature in that period that really tried to capture this complexity that they couldn't quite understand, but at the same time it was such a huge part of Indian society that they felt it had to be put down somehow. So you had group-based preferential treatment under colonial rule in some parts of the country. So in the 1920s, the south and the west of the country had states that were governed by independent, semi-independent rulers, and there was clearly political activity that led to affirmative action for these groups. So the largest groups in these areas had specific quotas, and these weren't quotas for categories, they were quotas for dominant castes. So that was true in South India, it was true in Western India. What happened subsequently when there was some decentralization of power under colonial rule was in 1935, the Government of India Act listed a group of a group of castes, which they called the scheduled castes because they were in a schedule. And then in the 10 or 15 years just before independence, there was a lot of mobilization. Together with the movement for independence came a movement which was led by a leader from one of these backward castes, which said that our vision of independent India must somehow get rid of some of these things we've been dealing with for a long time, untouchability in particular. And so there was a movement for getting rid of untouchability in the Constitution, but also for building in provisions that would really raise the level of these groups to the level of the general population. And so when the Constitution came in, it was a contradictory document with two articles that seemed to say different things. There was Article 15, which was very typical of most constitutions, which was really for equality before the law. And then there was Article 46, which said, the states shall promote with special care the educational and economic interests of the weaker sections of the people. And who was weaker was left. They had the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes, but they allowed the state to define castes as backward and then promote their interests. So it was this ambiguous and somewhat contradictory document. So what happened at the time of independence is there were these groups called the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and they did a fairly careful job of saying where exactly in the country are they backward. And so a caste might have been defined as backward in a particular part of a state, but not in another part of a state. So these affirmative action programs came with what were called territorial restrictions. What happened over time was the removal of these territorial restrictions. A group called the other backward castes, an enormous and amorphous group called the other backward castes, which consisted of about half the population. And what's happened in the most recently is that this group has got an extension of reservations extended towards them. And then there was lobbying by particular groups to be included as in one of these categories that they were not included before, and there was lobbying to be included. So that was the kind of action that was going on. And you have 3 minutes. I have 3 minutes. Oh, so then let me quickly just go through these numbers. These look at literacy rates. So what I've done is divide major castes in 1931 in a particular part of India. It's the central and eastern, what used to be in the center and eastern is now 2 different states of Bihar and Orissa. So you see that the forward castes, which did not get reservations, had literacy rates that were 30 or 40 times that of the most backward castes. And so you had no reservations for the top group, you had reservations for the middle group, and you had no reservations for the second group that was somewhere in the middle. So some groups within this category would say we're as backward as these ones over here. Some of them would be comparable to higher castes. And so given the time I have, let me just tell you what I find without going through the numbers. If you look at mobility for these groups separately between 1961 and 1991, which is after independence, you find that 2 characteristics are associated with higher mobility. One is group size. So if you were very backward, but you were large, you gained a lot. And if you were small, but you were near the top tail of this category, then you gained a lot. And this is exactly what we would expect from any model of political economy combined with selection into jobs. If you were near the top, you're going to get in when you lower the threshold. If you're big, then you might be able to get government spending to come to your area and improve. So finally, to conclude and talk about public goods, sorry, I'm taking 2 more minutes. To talk about public goods and affirmative action, we'd like to say, well, what if you didn't put so much emphasis on targeted programs and instead you really extended primary and secondary education? What would have happened? And well, we don't know what would have happened, as always. But an interesting case study is that of Kerala, because it's been talked about so much. So Amartya Sen and Jean Drèze have talked about Kerala for years, where they've said, look, here is a state which really looks like Scandinavia in some sense, if there's any counterpart. You have 100% literacy. you have good access to healthcare. Every village has a primary school. And so what this is an exercise just to show you whether Kerala is different or not. So what it does is it compares Kerala to the other states in the south and says, is it really different? And what you find is that almost the entire effect of public goods in Kerala is an effect of village size. So public goods are easier to provide in large villages. Clearly, a political party coming in will say, if we're choosing between the two, and we have large settlements, let's give them public goods. People will want public goods. Okay? We find that when you look across the south of India, if you compare the 3 southern states with Kerala, you find no difference in the probability of getting a public good once you control for size. So when you look within size categories, this area looks exactly the same. Kerala looks no different. And it has very good social outcomes. So what can we finally conclude? Well, affirmative action policies were designed to control role models initially and to tackle social stigma. So when they came in, there were policies that were in place for 10 years. Okay? Political logic meant that these kept getting extended, but also the umbrella kept expanding. It kept getting bigger. More groups came in for affirmative action policies because there was so much to gain. The gains from affirmative action have been unequal. They've depended on group size and the initial social hierarchy. So small groups at the bottom have been really left behind. And they've also led to this perverse demand for disadvantage. Okay? And a famous Indian anthropologist in anthropology and sociology are much closer in India than these disciplines have evolved in many other parts. So M.N. Srinivas wrote in 50 years ago that it's understandable that groups which are classed as backward show reluctance to give up the privileges of backwardness. And so what there has been recently, which is a bit disturbing, is this movement to say, well, we're also backward because we get our daughters married before we're legally allowed to do so, sort of thing. Okay? So there is this perverse demand for disadvantage. And in the largest state in the country, in terms of population, only 1/3 of villages have a primary school, and 96% of villages are without a high school. And this is the state with the largest number of scheduled castes. So I think what we do need to rethink in India is how exactly do we want to use affirmative action policies, and really do we want to shift attention to more universal public goods. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much. Questions, please? Any question? Yeah. Yes, you, 3, 4. Shall
we take them all together?
Yes, shall we take those first together? But I think that's fair enough. We'll reduce a bit the time of questions and replies from you.
Hi, I'm Prakash. One, I would like to comment upon your emphasis on self-reporting of caste. For long, it's been controlled very, very seriously by the state governments in the way in which they issue caste certificates. And, this is, right now I'm studying a policy process, and this is a big thing in the whole thing. So that needs to be understood, the way the state controls the self-reporting of caste, as you put it. And secondly, on your comment about the perverse demand for disadvantage, in some cases that's true, but in other cases I think it would it would better be termed as contestation of social identity. So,
yes, please. Could you introduce yourself to?
My name is Kamal Mitchinoy. I'm from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, where we've had affirmative action since the 1970s. Now, my first comment is that I think some of the refinements in the affirmative action you've not taken into account. For example, the question of differentiation intra-caste. Most states have other backward classes, most backward classes, most backward classes, and it goes up to 4 gradations. Secondly, I think there is an increasing understanding by government that apart from just giving reservation into education elsewhere, there should be measures to empower them with the means of livelihood. And if you remember the major commission on backward castes, Mandal Commission, it says the primary resource should be the distribution of land and the provision of production facilities in the rural sector. So I think the model is rather more complex than that. The last point is that in the Indian Constitution, there is a provision for other backward classes. They're called socially and educationally backward classes. But in the pluralism that is India, the Supreme Court has ruled that it's not just socially and educationally backward, but also economically backward. So here you have a dimension where those who have to get affirmative action also have to be poor, which is not true for the other backward classes. So I think the model is rather more complex than you were able to present in this time.
Thank you. Who else? Yes, you. Thank you.
It's a very interesting paper. I'm Ravi Srivastava from Jawaharlal Nehru University. I'm just coming from international conference in India on affirmative action. So, and we had a similar discussion with some of the papers there. The one thing I think which has already been clarified is that this category called other backward castes came only into existence after Mandal and the Supreme Court decision. Okay, it's a conflation of the terms social and economically, educationally backward classes in the Constitution. There is a distinction between the castes on which untouchability is practiced, has historically been practiced, scheduled castes, where self-reporting is not very much of an issue, or with scheduled tribes, and other backward castes within courts, where self-reporting becomes a very major issue. Because still it's a fluid category even now, much more fluid than scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. But I was looking in your paper, I was looking for a much clearer way of analytically or empirically looking at the impact of affirmative action. The table that you gave, which is 1931 to 1991, I'm not very sure because in 1991 we do have scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and we know that educationally they have moved upwards along with everybody else. But whether that's the impact of affirmative action or whether it's the impact of more schools or more demand, it's not very clear from your paper. So basically the paper itself doesn't bring out the impact of affirmative action versus an impact of various other variables that one is looking at. And unless you do that, you can't really look at different sets of policies and how they would impact on each other.
Thank you. There is a third question here. Yes, please. Yeah, if you want to use the mic.
I'm fine, I can speak up. So I was just wondering, to what extent has the very strong economic growth that India has experienced in the last years challenged the caste system and broken down barriers between different castes?
Any other question? Oh, yes. Thank you. That's the last one then. Thank you.
Maratlem Matlo from South Africa. Two questions, if I can, very quickly. Yes. The elections going on in India right now, I think the Guardian was reporting on Saturday that the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, I think it's a lady, yes, who herself is from the Dalits, might do very well. Your feedback on that and how that to be taken in India, and the issue of wanting to be included is a challenge that we are dealing with in South Africa, yes, yes, in the sense that the issue of entitlement. How do you wean people off from wanting government to do everything for them, but of course also wanting to bring in deal with inequality? I think the first speaker spoke about the Gini coefficient in South Africa being about 60, so that we see a need for it. But there's also the abuse that people, who are from, in South Africa it's based on color, but you've had people who have become very rich as a result of that, and you find few people benefiting from it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Those are all very interesting questions. I'll go in order.
You have 8 minutes, please.
Great. So, Prakash, on self-reporting, it's true, there was a lot more self-reporting when affirmative action policies had not come in, because once they come in, if you claim to be anything different from the list, then you don't get affirmative action. So the British government was actually always puzzled as to why communities spent so much time in giving themselves another name when the government didn't give them anything, for the most part. But it was just, part of the social structure. If you wanted to distinguish yourself, you suddenly got rich. So, for example, communities that pressed oil out of seeds, the oil pressers, there were times when world oil prices rose and they got rich and they said, okay, now we want to distinguish ourselves and we don't want to, we'll undergo a bunch of religious ceremonies, we'll turn vegetarian. So there were communities within there that then said we want to give ourselves a different name. Now, much less of that happened after independence because this list wasn't changing. So you didn't want to give yourself a different name because then your kids couldn't get preferential treatment. So, of course, self-reporting, the problems of self-reported caste identities did go down. But for these reasons, I don't think, for a large part for these reasons. And initially, of course, even the British government said that, look, if you come out with a name that clearly sounds wrong. So what lots of castes did, the Brahmins were at the top of the caste hierarchy. And so what a lot of castes did was to say, we're not calling ourselves Brahmins, but we're calling ourselves dash Brahmins. So they kept a part of their old name and then they attached Brahmins onto that. And the census commissioners were very reluctant to allow them to have that name. But then if they chose another name that didn't seem to have that connotation, then often they would allow it. So yes, self-reporting has gone down, but it remains the case that you can't pin people down to a caste. Ultimately, they are what they say they are. Kamal from JNU. It's true that there have been. You talked about the idea that together with affirmative action, we needed to raise rural livelihoods. Now, both the good and the bad thing about the Indian polity is that the rhetoric is fantastic, but what actually happens? So we're very committed to equality in debate, but that doesn't mean that that's how it's translating, that is being translated into policy. And I think this has very much been the case. The Constitution recognizes the right for every child to go to primary school and get educated for 14 years, until they're 14. Sorry, not 14 years. But it's not something that's happened. And so I think that part of what worries me about the affirmative action debate is not that affirmative action is a bad thing, but it's very hard to do it right, firstly. So it's very hard to end up with a situation where broadly parties feel that they've been justly treated. There would be, admissible grievances that are quite large. And secondly, that it's really taken attention away from, I think, public goods that would have done more. And here, actually, I'm going to jump to the South African gentleman whose name I didn't catch, I'm sorry, who talked about Mayawati and UP politics. So here is a woman, actually it's the first time that a scheduled caste party or a scheduled caste politician has actually become chief minister of a state. This happened. Who? Dalits. They were Dalits, is it? So I'm sorry. But certainly for UP, it was the first time. Now, the interesting thing is, you would think that when this happens, we'll say, look, 95% of these villages don't have schools. We're going to give them schools. Instead, the rhetoric has been that I'm going to make sure that not just Dalits, but Brahmins and all the castes that have been advantaged in the past, I'm going to make sure that if they're poor, they also get reservations. So the talk has been very much about, the rhetoric has been very much about reservations and more reservations rather than about universalization. And I think that this is a bit problematic.
Yes.
Ravi Srivastava from JNU, establishing causality, perfectly right. So all that I was trying to indicate with these numbers was that there's heterogeneity in gains within these. I'll just finish and then. There's heterogeneity in gains. Now, whether those gains are due to affirmative action, I actually think that if you're looking at the groups that were initially at the top, then there's a natural mechanism that by which affirmative action would influence those gains, because you're at the top, you go over the threshold instead of being below it. When you look at large parties, it might not be affirmative action directly. It might be that you're more powerful as a voting lobby, so you get more spending coming to your area. So there might be different mechanisms, and the idea was just to say that when we look at means for these groups, we really need to look at distributions within these categories. In terms of establishing causality, what we're working on now is really these territorial changes. So one of the ways in which you can establish causality is to say there's an event that occurred at a certain time which would affect how this group was placed relative to affirmative action advantages, but it wouldn't affect other things. So what happened is that within states in 1976, there was a change in territorial restrictions. And so that can be explored, that can be exploited to look at affirmative action policies relative to other things. And that's what we're working on now. But you're perfectly right. This is just provocative. It's nothing more than that. I think that's it. No? Widening inequalities. What has it done? That's your question. Kajal, your question was?
I was asking about the recent growth in India and how that has affected the caste system, or the rigidity of the caste system.
So I think that caste in urban India is definitely less salient than it is in rural India. And what has happened with the growth has certainly been a lot of urbanization. And so I think caste identities have become less salient. There are other programs that I think have done something for that. So for example, a few years ago, we had a nationally mandated school meal program. And so if you go to the public school, you get a free meal in the middle of the day, and public schools are not allowed to distinguish. Clearly, you can't have the scheduled caste sip separately from the other castes. And so I think that all these factors really have the potential. They're going down in any case, but I think they have the potential to make these things less salient. But I think on the other hand, the gains from affirmative action almost give an advantage to saying to distinguishing between castes, and I think that's problematic. I think that's probably my biggest worry with affirmative action policies.
Well, and may I add one observation? Actually, I don't know much about India and the caste system, but Bobbio, a political philosopher, says that, while civic rights are finite, social rights are infinite. And therefore, it depends very much on the way political movements, understood in that way, will impinge upon the government's responses.
Exactly.
So this is very interesting process to look how the concept of social rights has been evolving in parallel with this kind of development, affirmative action. Thank you very much for it. May I invite you now, Ingvild Almas. I don't know whether I pronounce well. She's assistant professor, Norwegian School of Economics and Business Administration. And the paper is Measuring International Income Inequality by Food Consumption.
Okay, so we'll go back to comparing across countries now. And it's more related to what Branko talked about earlier. But I will focus specifically on the PPP measures and the problems that we have in relation to those. So he just mentioned that he based his calculations on PPP measures, and I will discuss whether we can actually trust these measures or not. So we know that there are huge differences between people, and so across countries and across people. And one important question then is, are these differences increasing or decreasing? That is, do we have convergence or divergence across people and across countries? And the Penn-Well table is a table produced by some professors at Penn University in the US, which is the most used national incomes among economists. And if we base the calculations, so many calculations of convergence and divergence are based on the Penn-Well table national incomes. However, I find in this paper that these measures are biased, and hence we might not get the right answers when basing our calculations on the Penwell table incomes. So Branko already went through these three concepts in a very elegant way, so I think I will just mention very briefly that I will focus on the two first concepts in this paper. So international inequality is the unweighted comparison of mean income in countries. And then you have the weighted international inequality, where you weigh by population size. Then in most welfare studies, we would actually like to aim at the global inequality, but the problems that I'm sketching is related to how you can cross national borders, and hence they are illustrated as well with the two first concepts. So I will present some numbers for these two concepts of inequality. Okay, so the answer to the question, do incomes converge or diverge, very much rely on the measurement used for comparison. So here I just sketch two different measures. So one is very, very simple. It simply uses the exchange rate in order to compare incomes in different countries. So we cross a national border and we simply use an exchange rate to make a comparison between my income or the mean income of a Norwegian citizen to the mean income of a US citizen. And if you use this very simple measure, you would find that inequality increased. This is the weighted international inequality. So from 1980 to 1996, inequality increased according to the exchange rate-based measures. And I forgot to say, this is taken from Dowrick and Ackmal in Review of Income and Wealth, 2005 article. However, if you base your calculations on the Penwell table incomes, as I think Branko did, or at least the PPP measures, you would find a decrease in weighted international inequality in the same period. So we see here that the answer you get to this question very much rely on the measurement used for comparison. So I will propose in this paper a different measure which simply base the calculations on food consumption. And I'll explain that in detail. And I'll discuss how close I get to either of these measures. Okay, so I briefly said what the exchange rate-based measures are. They simply use the exchange rate or a running average. So the World Bank produces also a running average where you take the exchange rate the year before and the year after and the actual year that you want to study because we want to avoid the volatility of the exchange rate to matter too much. So, but anyhow, we have some problems when using these exchange rate-based measures. So first of all, prices differ across countries. So we know that my income would probably reach further in Tanzania than it actually does in Norway because prices are lower. And then you also have the problem of capital controls. So some countries would have, at least historically, one market exchange rate and one official exchange rate. So you do not really know which is the correct one to base the comparisons on. Then you have what is called real incomes of the Penwell table. So they would try to adjust for purchasing power differences. So they would try to adjust for the fact that prices differ across countries. But there are also problems related to these measures. And I'll mention two here. So first, you have the problem of measuring quality correctly. So for example, take two goods, a sugar substitute and sugar. So a sugar substitute like gur, which is which is consumed in Pakistan, is not consumed in Norway. So how do we really compare the price of gur, a sugar substitute, to that of sugar? So what we have to do is actually to combine it into the same broad goods category, and hence we would have a lower quality product in Pakistan than we have in Norway to base the comparison on. So this causes what I call a quality bias in the measures. Then you have a more technical thing, which is called a substitution bias, and I'll just mention very briefly what it is. It's due to the aggregation technique that we use for these measures, and it's because we have to have a reference some reference prices in order to, which is common for all countries to base the comparisons on. But then we measure the actual consumption bundles in countries, but we evaluate these actual consumption bundles by using a different set of prices. But then we know if actually consumers faced those other prices, they would have chosen differently. So they would have consumed more of what is less expensive at these reference prices and less of what is more expensive. So that creates what we call a substitution bias in the measures. So we see that both these measures have problems, and I propose a new method where we can try to find out which is doing better or how well the PPPs of the Penwell table are doing. And this method is based on Hamilton. It's a proposal of using household surveys and food consumption to reveal real incomes or actual incomes. So it makes corrections analogs to those of consumer price indices. So Hamilton would propose this for consumer price indices. So what is a consumer price index? That would be a time dimension. So we would focus on one country and we would look at overall price levels in one country and how it develops. And what we do with the PPP measures is directly analog because we do this across countries. So we compare overall price levels across countries instead of over time. I use household data, which is really detailed data, and we avoid aggregation technique biases. So what we do is simply to estimate something called angle curves for food. And Angle wrote an article in 1857 where he said that when you get richer, you spend less of your total budget on food. So this is a very simple law, but it's empirically very stable, both across countries and over time. So as we get richer, we spend less of our total budget on food. And what I will simply do in this paper is to estimate this relationship, how it looks like. So we would see how the budget share for food changed with income. And this means a budget share is not affected by these measurement problems, right? So a share is not affected by nominal values like exchange rates or PPP values. So if we think that the budget share for food is measured correctly, and we know the relationship between budget share for food and income, then it's enough that you tell me your budget share for food and I'll tell you your income. So this is a very simple idea, and this is what I do. So I use household data, as I said, and I measure the overall bias in PPP measures. So in the literature before, we have measured the substitution bias, but this takes into account also the quality bias. Okay, so this is to please the economists among you. So, which could ask, is this really what you estimate? Does it just fit data well, or is it actually in line with how we think consumers behave? And it is. I can assure you that it is. So it's consistent with utility maximization under a budget constraint. It has a cost function that has a flexible form, and homogeneous in prices, and preferences can be homothetic or non-homothetic. So it's quite flexible, the system that I estimate. Okay, and then some art. So those who are not very familiar with symbols and equations, I want you to look at this as art. I think it's quite beautiful, but I guess it depends on your taste. But anyway, I'll say everything by words, so hopefully it will be clear anyhow. Okay, so I estimate a demand system, which is called the almost ideal demand system. And it takes the budget share for food, it's MHJ of household H in country J, and it is dependent on the nominal income, which is here YHJ, and then it's deflated by the overall price level in the country, so it's PJ. And then we have a set of demographic controls. So we want to take into account that some households are larger, some are older, and those things. So they will go into what is called the X here. So we control for the fact that households differ. And through this relationship, we can actually estimate this relationship between budget share for food and income. So then you could tell me your budget share for food, and I can tell you your income through this relationship. That's the main idea. But there is one problem, and that is we don't know the overall price level in each and every country. So what we have to use is the Penwell table measured overall price level. And we can utilize that to actually find the bias in those measurements. So what we do here, we estimate the angle relationship, but then we look at systematic differences across countries. So if Tanzania overall is above this angle relationship, it has to do with price level being incorrectly measured because all households are above. So all other variables here are household specific, but the overall price level is country specific. So we can utilize these systematic differences across countries to find the bias in the Penwell table measures. So enough equations, I'll tell you what I do and what I find. So I have 9 benchmark countries where I have really detailed information. So I have 65,900 households from these 9 countries. It's a combination of different surveys. So I use the Living Standard Measurement Surveys of the World Bank. For 4 countries, it's Azerbaijan, China, Cote d'Ivoire, and Nicaragua. I use Luxembourg income surveys to study Italy, United Kingdom, and France. And I use consumer expenditure surveys for the US. And also from the Hungarian office, I have data from Hungary. This might seem a bit strange that I actually picked 2 countries from statistical offices because I want the data to be harmonized already. But there are reasons why I want these 2 countries to be in here. So US because it's large and important and rich. And Hungary because they have the prices that are closest to the prices we use to compare or evaluate consumption in the Penwell table, which means that we will actually, for Hungary, avoid the substitution bias, but we will still have the quality bias. Okay, so then I have an extended model where I use mean variables, so I can include 33 countries, because we want to be more general than the 9 countries. And I use 1995 and look at the measures, inequality measures, in 1995. Okay. So what are the results from this estimation? The result is that the poorer you are, the more your income is overestimated. So it's very systematic. And why could this be? It could be, so the quality bias, we would guess that this is the truth. Because quality tends to be lower in poor countries, and hence we tend to overvalue their income when not taking quality into account in the correct way. Second, the substitution bias, and this is also a more technical point, but the substitution bias will be larger the further away you are from, 5 minutes, yeah, fine. The further away you are from these reference prices that I talk about. And it turns out that the poor countries are further away from these reference prices than the richer countries. So we would also expect that to lead to poorer countries being overestimated. So you see here that the bias for Cote d'Ivoire is highest, and then you have Nicaragua, China, Azerbaijan. And then when you come to the OECD countries, Italy is an outlier here. It has a really high bias, although it's quite rich. And you have, for the OECD countries, are very much unbiased. So a bias of 1 here means that you should multiply you should divide your national income by 1, which means that it's correctly measured. So it's just relative to the US how we measure it. Okay, but secondly, so one thing is that you have a large bias if you're poor, but secondly, we have really large effects here. So this leads us almost back to the exchange rate-based method. So for China, for example, it says that we have a bias of 4, which means that we should actually divide China's national income by 4. And it's huge. And the exchange rate says that we should divide China's income by 5. So I mean, it's closer actually to the exchange rate, what I find, than to the PPP from the Penwell table. Yeah. Okay, so then I produce some new incomes. And what we see for the poor countries, the Penwell table is doing worse than for the rich countries. So it seems like for the poor countries, the exchange rate-based method is doing better, whereas for the rich countries, the PPPs of the Penwell table are doing better. So we get large adjustments downwards for, so this is, sorry, I didn't say what it was. So YPVT is Penwell table measured national income. Then you have YEC, which is angle curve, is my method, measured income. And then you have YEX, which is the exchange rate-based measured income. Okay, so we see here again, Italy is an outlier, so I really get the large down adjustment of Italy. And for the non-OECD countries, we get closer with the exchange rate, although for Azerbaijan, it's not very close anyway. And then for the richer countries, we get closer with the Penwell table. Okay, so what about inequality measures? So the Gini index, when you have the unweighted, so first you have the unweighted, then it's the weighted below. So for the benchmark countries, we get closer with the angle curve measures, but actually we get a larger inequality with the angle curve-based method than with both the exchange rate and the Penwell table. But remember here, there are many things going on. So I base my study also on the microdata. So yeah, so you have the quality bias, you have the substitution bias, and you have the fact that you move to microdata. And then you have the population weighted, where you come really close to the Gini based on exchange rates. Okay, and I have Lorentz dominance. So for those of you who are familiar with that, but since I'm short of time, I won't explain it in detail. But it means that not only based on the Gini index, but also other inequality measures, you would find that the Penwell table underestimate inequality. Okay, so how do they look like, these angle curves for food? This is just to show you that they look quite similar across countries. So these are the relationship between budget share for food and income at household level. So first of all, you see you have a very stable log linear relationship. So the functional form that we assume in the almost ideal demand system seems to be correct. But then second, they look quite similar also across countries. And hence we can utilize these systematic differences in angle curves to identify the PPP bias, or the bias in the Penwell table measured real income. Okay, so can we generalize this to other countries and other years? So what I simply do here is, when I've estimated this relationship, this angle relationship, I can use mean data from the UN to identify a PPP bias. So I would simply use the mean budget share for food for households in a country, and then identify the bias by using the difference or the deviation to the measured angle curve. And this gives me 33 new observations. So this is just a sample of the countries, and I get really large effects here for some countries. So I mean, this should be studied in more so we should have more studies on this before we conclude very robustly. But the systematic effect is here still. So the poorer you are, the larger the bias. And that's maybe what I believe in more myself. But I also get the measures. Okay. Yeah, can I just steal 5 minutes more, or 3 minutes more? Okay, so here I just sketched the bias in the Penwell table. This is, sorry. On the left side, you have the PPP bias, and here you have the exchange rate bias. So even though I concluded that maybe we're doing better with the exchange rate, you see here that you have also large biases by using the exchange rate. So we shouldn't trust any of these methods, I guess, is the conclusion. But you see that the biases are larger for the poorer countries using the Penwell table than the exchange rate, whereas the opposite is the case for richer countries. So we do better with the Penwell table for richer countries than the exchange rate-based method. And new Gini estimates, they show the same trend. Okay. So I said that both measures give biased estimates. we find a significant and systematic effect for the Penwell table, whereas we cannot actually identify any significant effect of the exchange rate bias. So I said already, the sum of absolute biases for this sample of 33 countries is larger for Penwell table than for exchange rate. But when you divide into rich and poor countries, you get this effect that I said, that the Penwell table is better for the richer countries. So I guess I've said it. The Penwell table incomes are substantially biased. We underestimate international inequality. The findings are robust, so we have Lorentz dominance, and we also have different specifications here. And the log linear model that I use seems to fit data well. So for international inequality, but this is, I mean, for this sample and very specific to this paper, so we shouldn't maybe conclude too harsh or be too harsh on this, but here it seems like we're better off using the exchange rate, in fact, although we know we have huge problems with that method.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions, please? Yes?
Yes, my name is Jean-Marie Ballon from Belgium. I found your exercise really interesting and the whole result project really worth it, and do not underestimate the amount of work that went into this. I'm not clear about two things. One is really the quality bias still remains in some way in the angle curves. Still not really how to think about it. Buying cheese in India is not the same as buying cheese in France. So the quality of the good you get, included in your food expenditures, are not strictly comparable. And my second problem has to do with, if you use angle curve, you have also something like a preference bias, where countries for which culturally is very important to eat, like Belgium, France, or Italy, will be obviously have an angle curve which is located much above. While countries like UK or I don't know, Netherlands, without being offensive, you have a preference bias there. It shouldn't be underestimated.
Okay, yeah, can I just answer now? Yeah.
Because there is another question. Two more questions, and you have another round. Could you, please?
No, I was thinking about Professor Elsner's suggestion this morning. He talked about the need for robust and simple ways of measuring. Well, we have, I am from Chile, sorry, my name is Riesco. We have a very robust and very simple method of measuring income inequality, but it's only valid for time series. Because what we do is we multiply the average wage by the number of workers. So we get what workers earn. And we compare that with GDP. And the differences are so huge that they mean something necessarily. For example, between 1929 and 2006, GDP multiplied 14 times. Meanwhile, the income of the mass of workers multiplied 20 times. So evidently, income improved. Now, we can also divide that by periods. So in the developmentalist period, in the first half of the century, all of the gains were made. Meanwhile, in the Washington Consensus period,
not in Brazil,
many of those were lost. Well, but the problem is, how can you use simple things like that to measure between countries? That's the question.
Okay, please.
I'm Ravi Srivastava from UNI. So I think the results are very interesting, and intuitively they seem to be in the right direction. But I just want to ask you three quick questions. One is, when you do these Engels curves, which is share of food expenditure. I mean, how is it that the quality of food issue gets resolved in that? Because, you know, one country you can be eating coarse cereals, in another country cakes. So, you know, the quality of food issue. The second is that the countries that you've taken in your sample, in some you've taken consumption expenditure surveys, in some others you've taken income expenditure surveys or income surveys.
No.
They're all consumption surveys because you said income surveys for group 2 when you listed the countries.
It's just called Luxembourg income.
Okay, but they're all consumption expenditure surveys. Because India is a part of the story, I just want to point out that in India we are struggling for many years to understand what is happening in terms of consumption expenditure. Because at very low levels of consumption, aggregate consumption, we have a share of falling, the share of food expenditure has been falling. You know, very low levels of aggregate consumption, high levels of malnutrition, and yet you have the phenomena of falling share in this. So it's not the classic Engels curve kind of explanation which you can have for explaining that pattern. Okay, so I think probably the story is in the correct direction, but you do need to nuance it.
Popov, please, yes. And then you reply for this round, and if we have time.
Now, maybe I misunderstood something, right? And you will tell me if I misunderstood something. But when you measure the share of, when you reconstruct income based on the numbers of the share of food in total budget, you are subject inevitably to this Balazs-Samuelson effect, which is known in economics. And this Balazs-Samuelson effect is about prices for tradables and non-tradables, right? In developing countries and in developed countries. The more developed is the country, the higher are the prices of non-tradables. And the reason for this is that tradable prices are the same all over the world, although empirically we don't find this evidence, but at least in theory, right? And the prices of non-tradables, they depend on wages. So the prices of non-tradables are lower in developing countries, and that is exactly why the total level of prices in developing countries is lower. And that is exactly the reason why the PVP measures give you different results as compared to the comparison based on the exchange rate, official exchange rate, right? Now, food, of course, is a tradable, but in fact it's a non-tradable because of the heavy weight of food. So prices of food would be less correlated among countries than prices for other tradables, which means in developing countries food would be cheaper, right, generally, as a non-tradable, right, considered as a non-tradable. If it is cheaper, that means the share of income spent on food is actually understated. And that is why comparisons of incomes in countries based on Engels comparisons, right, or your comparisons, are much closer to exchange rate comparisons than to PVP.
No, yeah.
That seems to be.
Okay.
Okay. Well, that's the last one. Okay, I'll take it then. We'll have time for you to.
Ivan Možný, Czech Republic. I appreciate your contribution, methodological, and my remark is only that there is another statistics or measures of the food consumption. It is the health statistic of the share of obesity people in the population. There is a big inequality in this measure. The United States,
share of
obesity, the share of fat people in the population, yeah, and you can see it in the health statistics internationally. And I was fascinated that it was very similar to your results, because the United States are first. They are classed for their own. There are about over 40% of fat people. Then there is a United Kingdom. There is something 33. The European Union average is about 20%. I only mention it that for you it could be interesting to compare these two measures, the one figure, simple measure, and your elaborated, valuable measure. Thank you.
Okay. Now, see you. It's your time.
Okay. Thank you all. First, the quality bias in the angle curve. So this would only be a problem if you have a different quality for food, so the relative quality difference between food and non-food differ across countries. So it's not a problem if it's an overall quality difference, which I expect is more plausible. But if you have it specifically on food and non-food, that might be a problem. And it's very much related to some of the other questions, which is how do we account for the fact that relative prices might differ on food and non-food items, which I actually correct for, but I can discuss it in more detail when I get to that question. Then you asked about the preference bias, and I think you're right. This might be an explanation why Italy is such an outlier. Right. However, when you test this, I mean, when you look at different studies on angle curves, it's very, very stable compared to all other goods. It's very much stable over time, and it seems to be very stable across countries as well. So this is just an empirical, we have some empirical evidence that they should look similar. But there is no theoretical argument that I could provide for you which says that. So we just have to rely on the fact that it seems to behave very much similarly. Whereas if you take other goods like, you know, this Banks, Blundell, Lubel article, they discuss the functional form of many different goods, and you cannot really say, and it depends very much on many things, but for food it seems really stable. So that's the only comment I have for that. Then it's the robust and simple ways. Argentina. Chile, sorry, Chile. Okay, so I'm not, you have to correct me here if I didn't fully understand what you meant. So first you discussed the difference between using macrodata and microdata, if I understood you correctly, so taking from the GDP and then taking from micro wage or income surveys. That's what you started with your motivation. So all I do is consumption-based. So there shouldn't be a problem when I cross borders in the direction that I think you're pointing at, that you could differ when some have income service, some have consumption-based service. So this is just consumption or expenditure. Expenditure in the terms that we actually measure the in-kind and the self-produced consumption. Did that answer your question, or?
No, in fact,
Yeah, we can discuss it afterwards, maybe, yeah. Please, so, okay, so then it was, again, I think, a question on the quality bias or potential quality bias in the angle curve, and I think I answered that already, right? Then it was to the Balassa-Samuelson effect. So, yeah, totally. I mean, this is the problem with the PPP measures. But again, we have this empirical evidence that the angle curve looks this specific way. So there is no, again, theoretical argument that I can say, no, it's not working in the direction that you say, but it seems like budget share for food, independent of price levels, would behave in exactly this manner. So when you get richer, you spend less. And then we correct for relative price differences across countries on food and non-food. Okay, so this is it's an important point which I discuss a lot in the paper because we don't have data which make us able to identify the coefficient for relative prices, because in order to do that we would need regional within country variation in relative prices. So what I simply do is take a coefficient from other studies and then I use national averages on the price difference between food and non-food. And I can only also do this for a subsample of countries. But I am able in one of the robustness checks to include also some poor countries. So it doesn't matter. It does really not matter if you include relative prices. So this is not what is driving the results. I was also a bit insecure about that, but when I did the robustness check, I'm really certain that these effects are so large that it's not driven by the relative price effect. Okay, then it was the obesity or the fatness. So I think if I understood you correctly, this would actually lead to my measures being underestimating the effect. Because if this is a larger problem in the US, you would think that they have a larger budget share for food in the US than what they should have according to their income level. So it would actually just say that the US is even more richer than it seems from my calculations relative to the other countries. Okay, so thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Branco.